to run the new Alberta.
They would beg to negotiate a new deal.
The system could not be fixed.
Responsibility isn't something you outsource.
Alberta could be the new America.
Our first speaker has his PhD in political science, is the author of Time to Leave and Canada Cannot Be Fixed. He argues the status quo is unsustainable. Reform is blocked, Alberta's voice is ignored. Please welcome Dr. Michael Wagner.
Thank you, Sean, for that introduction. Tonight, I'm going to speak on the fact that Alberta must choose between the status quo and independence. Now, I think most Albertans currently feel that our province is not being fairly treated within Canada. I think that Darrell just mentioned that. Of course, we would prefer for Alberta to be fairly treated within Canada. Indeed, I think the old motto of the Reform Party, the West wants in, is still the true heart's cry of most Albertans. The West wants in. We want our voices heard in Ottawa. You could easily get a majority of Albertans to agree that if Canada could be reformed so that Alberta could fit properly within this country, that's what they would want. That's what people really want. Unfortunately, we cannot have what we want. The reform option for Canada is not available. For decades, Albertans and other Westerners have tried to get a better deal for the West, but to no avail. There wasn't anything wrong with their approach. They worked hard and did well. And I do think that the early period of the Reform Party is the truest expression of historic Western sentiment in terms of our relationship with Central Canada. The Reform Party effort was the right thing to do at the right time. The problem is that while the West wants in, the East does not want us in. That is the problem, the reality that we have to face. Therefore, in my view, Alberta only has two options: the status quo or independence. Now, to understand this point, it's important to look at Alberta's history over the last few decades. The Prairie provinces have had serious grievances with the federal government going back over a century, right from the very beginning of our existence here. So our place within Canada has had some significant difficulties over the years. However, those difficulties did not lead to a movement for independence until Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau came along. He wanted to fundamentally change this country by centralizing power more in the federal government and by moving the country in a more socialistic policy direction. He did many things to harm this country, in my view. One of the things he did was to unleash a political and economic attack on Alberta that was unprecedented in Canadian history. The federal government never attacked a province like it attacked Alberta in the 1970s, and this is important to remember. In 1973, Trudeau's government imposed a federal oil export tax to siphon revenues out of Alberta. At about the same time, a war in the Middle East caused the price of oil to skyrocket, and as a result, the export tax would cost Alberta billions of dollars of oil revenues that belonged here but went to the federal government. Those revenues were rightfully ours because natural resources belonged to the province. Premier Peter Lougheed called the export tax on oil, quote, probably the biggest ripoff of any province that's ever occurred in Confederation's history. Then throughout the 1970s, Lougheed fought to get Alberta a fair deal for its oil. But despite Lougheed's best efforts, things got much worse when Trudeau unleashed the National Energy Program, or the NEP, in October of 1980. The NEP devastated Alberta's economy, destroying businesses, destroying jobs, and devastating the lives of thousands of people. And you can still meet people today who can tell you how their dad lost their job or their family lost their home because of the deliberate policy of Pierre Trudeau in 1980 and the early 80s. Now, two of the Liberals' stated reasons for the National Energy Program were achieving greater energy self-sufficiency for Canada and Canadianizing the oil industry because they thought there was too much American ownership. But the publicly stated reasons offered by Trudeau and his cronies were largely a smokescreen, and we know that because several years later, Marc Lalonde, who had been energy minister at the time of the National Energy Program, he later admitted that those weren't the real reasons, the ones that they offered publicly. And he's quoted as saying this. This is what Marc Lalonde said, quote, "The major factor behind the NEP was not Canadianization or getting more from the industry or even self-sufficiency. The determinant factor was the fiscal imbalance between the provinces and the federal government. Our proposal was to increase Ottawa's share appreciably so that the share of the producing provinces would decline significantly and the industry's share would decline somewhat. That is the real purpose of the National Energy Program, was for the federal government to confiscate much of Alberta's oil wealth." Now let me repeat, this sort of attack by the federal government on one particular province is unprecedented in Canadian history. Now, the pent-up anger towards Trudeau's attacks on Alberta would subsequently contribute to the rise of the Reform Party of Canada, although the actual event that triggered the creation of the Reform Party of Canada was undertaken by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. You might remember that in 1986, Brian Mulroney's government had recently purchased CF-18 fighter jets, and they needed to find a city or a company that could maintain those fighter jets. It was a very large government contract to maintain the CF-18 fighter jets. There were 2 cities in Canada with the facilities to maintain them, Winnipeg and Montreal. So the government held a competition to see which city should win the contract, and Winnipeg won that contract according to the government's criteria, and Mulroney awarded the contract to Montreal. This, of course, led to considerable uproar and anger in the West, and that outrage led to the creation of the Reform Party of Canada. With a CF-18 fighter jet contract being awarded to Montreal, Albertans realized that it didn't really matter which political party was in power in Ottawa. Unless the constitutional rules were changed, the West would continually be disadvantaged and ripped off. So the Reform Party of Canada began forming under the leadership of Preston Manning, and Manning wanted the new party to advocate for the West getting equal treatment within Canada rather than separating from Canada. The idea was to get the national institutions of Canada reformed so that the voice of the West could be heard within the national government in Ottawa, and our voices would not be ignored as they had been for so long. So the Reform Party of Canada, in 1993, in the federal election, they won 52 seats from the West. And then in the federal election in 1997, they won even more seats from the West. So we had our voice in Ottawa. We elected our MPs and sent them to Ottawa. But the reforms that we desired as Westerners did not materialize. Why not? Because the federal government does not care what reforms Alberta wants for this country. Academics Roger Gibbons and Lolene Berdahl explain Central Canada's attitude towards the Reform Party this way. I'm going to quote from these academics, Roger Gibbons and Lolene Berdahl. This is what they said, quote, "The Reform Party's clarion call that the West wants in was widely derided outside the West as narrow regionalism unsuitable to a truly national party. Indeed, the party system has helped to define regional in the case of the West, and the West alone as somewhat antithetical to national. Parties based largely in Ontario and Quebec are self-defined as national, a definition generally accepted by the media and the elite political discourse. Parties based largely in the West are defined and defined successfully by their opponents and the media as regional. The West is the only Canadian region earmarked in this fashion, and the only region with interests assumed to be at odds with the national interest, whatever that might be. So this is why the Reform Party was unable to achieve its objectives, because the interests of the West are assumed to be at odds with the national interest." Now, besides the Reform Party, the West expended considerable efforts trying to achieve Senate reform. During the conflict between Alberta and Pierre Trudeau in the 1970s, our Premier, Peter Lougheed, created a Citizens Advisory Committee on the Constitution to make recommendations to the provincial government about how Canada could be reformed. One of the members of that committee was Jean Deas, a University of Calgary professor of law, constitutional law, and he convinced the rest of the committee that the way to improve Canada was to change the Senate. If we made the Senate elected, because our Senate still is not elected, it's appointed by the Prime Minister, if we had elected senators with an equal number of senators from each province, that would be the kind of reform in our national institutions where the Western provinces could be properly represented. So because of that committee's work and Jean Deas, Senate reform became a priority of the Alberta government. Then in 1981, the Canada West Foundation published a significant proposal for Senate reform entitled Regional Representation, the Canadian Partnership. It was written by 3 people, one of whom was Senator Ernest Manning. Ernest Manning had been Alberta's longest-serving premier and also a political scientist and another prominent person. So they wrote this very significant proposal for Senate reform. Their central argument was that Canada needed to reform its national institutions in order to provide a voice for the West within the national government. Otherwise, the West might separate from Canada. They proposed Senate reform as a way to get Western voices heard within Canada's national government. Subsequently, in 1983, an Alberta Committee for an Elected Senate was created to promote this idea. It was headed by a guy named Burt Brown, who was a very well-known Senate reform activist. It was also at this time when Ted Byfield of the Alberta Report magazine invented the term Triple E to describe a particular form of Senate reform that would be very beneficial for the West. And so the Alberta Committee for an Elected Senate, its ideas became more popular outside of Alberta, so it was changed to the Canadian Committee for Triple E Senate. So the idea of the Triple E Senate would enable the Senate to properly represent provincial interests. The Triple E's stood for, number one, there'd be an equal number of senators from each province. Number 2, the senators would be elected. And 3, they'd have effective powers to block the House of Commons. So a Triple-E Senate along those lines would give the West representation within the national government, and we would not feel that we're being ignored all the time. Now, the Alberta Progressive Conservative Party, which of course at that time was the governing party, endorsed the Triple-E Senate proposal at a 1984 convention. Then in March 1985, the Alberta government's Special Select Committee on Senate Reform also endorsed the Triple-E Senate proposal and recommended that the Alberta government endorse it. A few months later, Don Getty became premier. He too personally endorsed, and on behalf of the Alberta government, the idea of the Triple-E Senate as a reform that Canada needed. And then in 1988, he created a Senate Reform Task Force to promote the Triple-E Senate idea right across Canada to the other provinces. Then in October of 1989, Alberta held Canada's very first Senate candidate election. For the very first time in Canada, there was an election for senators, and the person who won that was Stan Waters of the Reform Party, and Brian Mulroney actually did appoint him to the Senate. So that was the very first time in Canadian history there was an elected senator. Now, despite the best efforts of Alberta government and the Reform Party, Senate reform then stalled. However, there was one more chance at Senate reform. After the Reform Party was transformed into the Canadian Alliance, one of the original reformers, Stephen Harper, became leader of the Canadian Alliance. Then in 2003, he led the Canadian Alliance to join the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada to form the new Conservative Party of Canada. Stephen Harper was the leader of that party, and of course in 2006, he was elected as Prime Minister. Now, after winning the 2006 election, Harper aggressively pursued Senate reform using the powers at his disposal as Prime Minister. In May of 2006, Harper's government introduced a Senate reform bill into the Senate itself, and Harper testified to the Senate committee studying that bill, and that's very unusual for a Prime Minister to testify before a Senate committee, but it shows how strongly Stephen Harper actually believed in Senate reform. Then a few months later, his government also introduced a Senate reform bill into the House of Commons that would have authorized consultative elections for senators in Canada. That's the same kind of thing that Alberta's been doing, where we'd have elections for senators, and they were consultative because the Prime Minister would not be under obligation to appoint the senators who were elected, but there would be pressure on him to do so, and a number of Alberta senators in recent years were elected through these consultative elections. So that's what one of Harper's bills was trying to achieve. Now, these bills that I just mentioned, they both died, but Harper would reintroduce the bills into the Senate and into the House of Commons to try and keep the Senate reform movement going. So during his first 7 years in office, 3 such bills were introduced into the Senate and 5 were introduced in the House of Commons. This just shows how hard Stephen Harper was trying to push the Senate reform idea. Then in 2007, he appointed Burt Brown to the Senate. Now, Burt Brown had been the head of the Canadian Committee for Triple-E Senate. It was well known. He had won 2 of the Senate consultative elections in 1998 and 2004. But by appointing Burt Brown to the Senate, it was showing, again, his commitment to Senate reform. Now, problems arose because in 2012, the Quebec government initiated a reference case challenging Stephen Harper's Senate reform bills. So the Quebec government did this reference case to the Quebec Court of Appeal to ask the Quebec Court of Appeal if what Stephen Harper was doing was constitutional. Now, to head off this reference case from Quebec, Stephen Harper himself then initiated a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada so that he could be the one asking the questions of the court and perhaps get a better outcome. But as it turned out, in fact, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that any kind of Senate reform, even the kind that Stephen Harper wanted, could only be achieved through a constitutional amendment. So by saying it could only be achieved through a constitutional amendment, that basically killed the Senate reform movement because basically it made it impossible. So here we see a man, Stephen Harper, dedicated to Senate reform, finding that once he became Prime Minister, his attempts at Senate reform were thwarted at every step of the way. Of course, the opposition party opposed his Senate reform ideas. The Senate itself opposed them. Many people within his own caucus opposed the Senate reform ideas. Many provincial premiers opposed it. And of course, the courts finally put an end to it. So here you have it. Stephen Harper, a man who was committed to constitutional reform to benefit the West, became Prime Minister, and over a period of years used every tool at his disposal to reform the Senate. But he could not prevail in the face of intense opposition from central Canada. If Stephen Harper could not reform the Senate, then it cannot be done. If the Prime Minister of the country cannot push through reforms to change the Senate for the benefit of Alberta and the West, it can't be done. And if Preston Manning and the Reform Party cannot get the West's voice heard within Ottawa, then it can't be done. Albertans must realize that we sent our best people to Ottawa to fix the system, but the system could not be fixed. Spending the next few years trying to reform Canada's constitution would end in frustration and failure, as it always has in the past. Now, we got to look back at this history I've just talked about very briefly, and we have to look back at this history and we need to ask, what more could we have done? What more could we have done? We spent decades trying to reform this country. We tried decades trying to reform the Senate and getting elected representatives who could change for us there. We've tried that. What else could we have done? The game is over. It's time for Alberta to secede from Canada and become an independent country. With our own country, we will be able to elect leaders who will answer to us and do what's best for us, not what's best for Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. In this way, we will be able to achieve the greatest level of freedom and prosperity possible for our families and for our descendants. We need independence, not the status quo. Thank you. We sent our best people to Ottawa to fix the system, but the system could not be fixed.
They will beg to come sit at our table to negotiate a new deal.
And that is the way we're going to run the new Alberta.
Yet successive governments, blue or orange, have not done them.
About $1 billion a week on interest payments on the national debt.
It was inserted to bring about a technocratic overhaul of our government.
We're actually all on the same page for now in trying to pursue the same policies that will improve fairness for Alberta.
Responsibility isn't something you outsource.
And complete control of our own destiny here in Alberta.
They don't want to make change now, but they know that they can.
Alberta could be the new America.